Hello, I'm John Beekman, a reference librarian here at the New Jersey Room of the Jersey City Free Public Library. And we're very happy to be able to share a special program celebrating one of the many historic religious institutions of Jersey City, the Church of Christ the King, which is celebrating the 90th anniversary of its founding as the first African American Catholic congregation in the state of New Jersey. While in some ways fitting a familiar pattern of parishes formed to serve the needs of immigrant groups as their numbers grew in the city, as had happened with German, Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrant communities. In this case, these were Black Americans coming up from the American South, coming to Jersey City and Hudson County as part of the Great Migration. And so the story of Christ the King is a special case, which can tell us a lot about our state, local and national history at the time of the church's founding, at the start of the Great Depression, and into today. So joining us today to tell that story is Dr. Valerie D. Lewis-Mosley, Director of Religious Education at Christ the King and Professor of Theology at Caldwell University. A former nurse, Dr. Lewis-Mosley pursued her graduate studies in religion at Xavier University Institute of Black Catholic Studies, Seton Hall, and Drew Theological Seminary. And I am grateful that she has agreed to join me today to present her talk on Sankofa, Aggiornamento, Jubilee, the historical legacy of faith. And with that, I'll welcome Valerie.
Good afternoon, John. Thank you for having me. The invitation to be able to tell the story, the narrative history of my faith community of Christ the King is always an opportunity for me to sort of brag about, particularly during this 90th celebration of our life in Jersey City as a faith community, a Black Catholic faith community. I would like to begin with sharing my screen, if it's okay with you, and begin to tell a little bit of the story of Christ the King in Jersey City.
Wonderful, thank you.
We begin with Sankofa, Aggiornamento, Jubilee, recalling our past, envisioning our today, imagining our tomorrow, going to the past, remembering it, and with it, turning to the future. It is always a great opportunity to share the history and the legacy of Christ the King Parish, which is a community of Catholics who are Black Catholics particularly, given witness to their faith as Catholics. The legacy of Christ the King begins 90 years ago, when many of our ancestors, and even still some of our elders, because we do have an elder who is celebrating her 100th birthday, literally as we speak, as folk came from the South with the Great Migration, they brought with them their faith traditions as well. For Black Catholics who were familiar with being able to participate in the liturgies of the South, albeit it was by segregated communities, it was with their expectation that when they came north, that they would be able to have full membership and full participation within their Catholic tradition. Unfortunately, many Black Catholics were turned away at the parish doors or not meant to felt welcome for Sunday liturgy. Over the course of time, numbers of Black Catholics decided to attend Black Protestant churches, Black church traditions where they felt more welcomed. As this became to be a more of an occurrence of normality as opposed to an anomaly of the faith, many of the Black Catholics began to look for a way where they could be able to go to Mass and not feel as if they were being left at the door. One of the spokespeople that wind up raising to the occasion, her name was Mary Ward. Mary Ward herself was a Catholic that came from Washington, D.C. She was a parishioner at St. Augustine's Parish, which is known as the Mother Church of Black Catholic churches. Mary Ward was very familiar with many of the Catholic churches in Jersey City, and she actually attended All Saints, which is a Catholic church that used to be at the corner of Communipaw and Pacific Avenue. It has been closed sometime in reference to the physical building structure, but over the years it has merged with St. Pat's and other churches from downtown Jersey City. In any event, in the late 1929 area going into 1930, Mary, along with other Catholic women, began to be concerned about the fact that they did not have the opportunity of really practicing their faith in a setting where they felt welcome and at peace. They decided to do something about it. They took an idea that they saw in reference to many of the parishes in Jersey City. Many of the parishes in Jersey City are referred to at that time as ethnic parishes. Parishes of Jersey City were set up based on language, on their ethnicity, and often on their place of birth. Mary and the women got together along with their families and began to take an account of how many of the families were Catholic within the Jersey City and often even in the Bayonne area. Having come up with a census of about 300 names, Mary and her colleagues made an attempt to meet with the bishop at that time, who was Bishop Walsh. The area of Newark had not yet become an archdiocese. It was still considered a diocese. So Mary met with the vicar, who was sort of a representative of the bishop. And she shared with him some of the concerns that had become a problem for the Black Catholics in Jersey City. As you note on the slide in front of you, the priest who was the vicar, his name was Edward Kirk. And he listed this conversation with Mary in reference to the concerns of the Black Catholics of that day as a survey of the Negro problem in Jersey City. There were the following churches that were listed: St. Patrick's, which had a representation of about 6 Black families; St. Peter's Church, which had a representation also of about 6 families; St. Bridget's downtown with about 2 families; St. Aloysius on West Side Avenue with about 2 families; St. Aidan's, which was up near McGinley Square with 2 families; and All Saints, which was, as I stated, on the corner of Pacific and Communipaw with approximately 9 families. The great bulk of the Negro population seemed to be centered in the Lafayette section. Monsignor Mahan, who was the pastor at the time at St. Patrick's, referred Mary Ward, who lived at that time at 419 Pacific Avenue, to the archdiocesan vicar. Mary, as it states, was a Negro woman who had done considerable work and who was active in her Catholic parish. In an interview with Mrs. Ward, Reverend Kirk responded, "Mary Ward, who is a very intelligent woman, it was learned that through a census of Negro Catholics about a year and a half prior to this, that there were approximately 300 Negro Catholics in the city of Jersey City. Mrs. Ward is most enthusiastic over the possibility of a church distinctly Negro and feels certain that a great work can be done in propagating the faith among the people of her race in the city. Mrs. Ward has promised to take a census immediately and furnish me with the results. The property of Lafayette Presbyterian Church is very well located and can be easily adapted to purposes proposed." Now, the information that I'm reading and the slide that you're looking at comes out of the archives that are located at Seton Hall in reference to some of the historical documents from the church. And so this time frame would have been early 1930, late 1929. This is a photo of Mary Ward. Ward is her married name. Her name was Mary Queenan Ward. And as I stated, she was originally from St. Augustine Parish in Washington, D.C., the mother church of Black Catholics. This is another photo of Mary. When Mary began to have her conversations with the archdiocese, one of the folklores of the conversation that she had with Father Kirk as well as with the Monsignor at All Saints, was the Irish have their parish, the Italians have their parish, the Germans have their parish, and we Negroes should have our own parish as well. In the beginning of this conversation, there was a priest by the name of Father Shavlin, who had already begun to do work down at St. Bridget's, engaging those who were colored and Catholic so that they could begin to have catechesis and a formation, ongoing formation for their religious sacraments, and as well for the wholesomeness of their family life. Walsh, who shortly after this became an archbishop, had a listening ear to the plight of Mary Ward and her colleagues. This is Reverend Walsh, Bishop Walsh, and Father Shavlin that we see flanked on each side of Mary in this photo. And this photo would have been taken in the late 1930s, 1930 particularly. This photo is a picture of Mary Ward's husband. The irony is that with Mary Ward and so many of the women being the forerunners to forming the parish, at the point that the parish was finally formalized and incorporated, there were some very special pontifical awards that were given out. You would think that it would have gone to Mary and the women who worked with her, but they did not. It went to her husband, Mr. Ward. This is a letter from the Monsignor speaking about the property at Lafayette Presbyterian Church, which at that time, the church itself was located right off of Summit Avenue, but the property was located on the southeastern corner of Ocean Avenue. This is the property that was used to purchase and to be able to build for the construction of the new church that will become Church of Christ the King. As the Bishop Walsh began to have conversations around the needs of the Black Catholics in the city of Jersey City, the census of that time gave a report of the number of folk in Jersey City who were Catholic. 129,569 people out of 315,642 residents, almost half were Catholic. It also gave a census of the number of our Jewish brothers and sisters, Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopals, all the way down the line. This is also another slide that gives some insight as to the census that made up the different faith traditions in Jersey City. Upon seeing that census, the bishop realized that there definitely was a need in order to be able to fulfill his mandate as the pastoral shepherd of the area. According to canon law, the bishop is responsible for the spiritual well-being of not just Catholics, but for all those souls within his diocese. So he had a particular responsibility to make sure that the colored Catholics of Jersey City were not feeling as if they were being left out of their own church. This here is a little bit of a slide that is taken from 1941, which is about 11 years after Christ the King was formed. If you would look along the slide, you will see that where it says Christ the King, in parentheses right next to it, it says colored. This was not an anomaly. If you look below, Holy Rosary Church, which was downtown and which was an Italian parish, was listed as Italian. So as Mary begins to engage with the bishop and with Father Shavlin, who becomes the pastoral spiritual director per se, the bishop gives permission for there to be a formation of a church, particularly for the apostolate and evangelization of Black Catholics. On July 3rd of 1930, the letters of incorporation were signed so that there would be this official formation of the parish, which was known as Church of Christ the King. Although there was no building, and although the ground had yet to be broken, the community of believers is what really made up the church. The women and their families had begun to gather in a small little rectory where Father Shavlin lived on 291 Forest Street. The numbers of 12 soon grew to 20, to the point where the little house could no longer contain the number of colored Catholics that would come there for Mass. Across the street from the area that would later be Christ the King Church was a Negro funeral home. And the reason I'm using the word Negro or colored is because we're talking about a time frame of 1930 where that was the nomenclature that was used. Johnny White's funeral home, which took care of the deceased colored and Negroes of Jersey City, Johnny White himself was not a Catholic. He was a Black Christian, but not Catholic. He was so impressed with this fervor that was growing within the community of colored Catholics to build their own church that he allowed his chapel in the funeral home to be used for their masses. Although the women and their children and their husbands had been coming together at 291 Forest Street, and the numbers grew and grew, the chapel of Johnny White became their temporary home while they planned to build their own church. On July the 5th of 1930, at Public School number 14, there was sort of a town hall meeting in the auditorium where the women, their families, their neighbors, their friends, a large number of the Jersey City population had gathered to hear about the celebration of this Negro Catholic Church. So impressed with the idea that these Catholics were steadfast in creating their home church, a safe haven for themselves, that a brother and a sister, Mr. Smith and his sister Margaret, they were residents of 95 Bentley Avenue, and they were parishioners at St. Aloysius. They decided to match the funds in order to help build the church that Mary Ward and her friends and family members had begun to initiate. This is a photo right here of the gathering at Public School number 14. It is said from the newspaper accounts that so many were in attendance that it was standing room only, and the crowds flowed outside of the school onto the sidewalk. On the center of the photo, you have Father Shovlin, and to the right of Father Shovlin, who is standing there with his arms crossed, is a gentleman by the name of C. Bynum Jones. To the far left of the photo is Miss Smith and her brother, who were benefactors who participated in financing a large portion of the building of the parish, the Church of Christ the King. This is another photo which allows you to see with a little bit more clarity. July 28th, 1930. The parish of Jersey City, even though the building itself had not been built, has a baptism. And the first baptism in this Negro parish is for the daughter of the doctors Madison and Dr. Lena Edwards. Now, Dr. Edwards is well known these days throughout Jersey City, and she's well known throughout history because of her work as an obstetrician and also her work with migrant workers in the Mid-South. Dr. Edwards herself and her husband were both from the Washington, D.C. area. Like Mary Ward, Lena Edwards had also come from St. Augustine's Parish in Washington, D.C., another parishioner who hailed from the Mother Church of Black Catholics. Although Lena Edwards was not initially one of the members in the formation of the parish, she very quickly became very much involved in its business, its affairs, its concerns for the neighborhood. Her daughter Genevieve Ann, is the first to be baptized at Christ the King. Dr. Edwards and her family actually donated the baptismal font, which is still in use at the parish to this day. Along with Dr. Edwards' daughter, Genevieve Ann Regina, her husband as well was one of the first converts at the parish. This is a photo of our first adult converts. To the far left Well, to the far right, as you're looking at it, would be C. Bynum Jones, who I mentioned earlier, as well as other parishioners. One who's also known as Jeanette Jackson, who will later be able to be involved in this story because of her great feat in evangelizing 300 Catholics, 300 people for evangelization within 18 months of her own baptism and her own conversion. This is Father Shavlin in the center of the photo. In the backward of the photo would be also Dr. Edwards' husband, Dr. Madison, who was a pediatrician in Jersey City for many, many years. This is a letter that's discussing the nuns, the sisters, who come to assist with the spiritual direction and care of the new parishioners for Jersey City. One of the nuns, her name is Sister Peter Claver, and along with her are two others who will be holding a mission on August the 15th. This is a few days after the groundbreaking for the building of the parish. So immediately, just as Mary Ward and her friends and her family members and her relatives begin to work on building up a faith community for the apostolate of colored Negroes, right away the work begins to take fold. This is an invitation that is sent for the cornerstone laying of Christ the King. Now, the groundbreaking took place on August the 12th, and by August the 28th, they were already preparing for the groundbreaking. At the groundbreaking of Christ the King, nearly 4,000 people were in attendance. Prior to the groundbreaking, this is a letter of communication between the Sisters of the Most Sacred Blessed Trinity, known as Trinitarian Sisters, whose mother house was initially in Philadelphia. The sisters came on board to help with the evangelization mission and to help with the faith development of the colored Catholics who would form Christ the King Church. This is an invitation for the groundbreaking, for the cornerstone laying, sorry. The cornerstone was laid on October the 26th at 3:00 p.m., 1930. It seems like a mighty long time away, but not so long when we still have a parishioner there who will celebrate her 100th birthday in a matter of days. This is a conversation discussing the change of many of the Negro migrants from the Deep South with the Great Migration, and not only have many of them come as Catholics, but some have come without any faith at all. And they've taken on this faith tradition, as is referenced in this newspaper clipping, as the solemnity. This is the throng of 4,000 plus gathered on Ocean Avenue at the site of what would become Christ the King Church. This is another photo. This is an article that evening from the Jersey Observer, which was a newspaper, talking about the cornerstone laying of the colored church that would come on that Sunday. A big parade and a banquet was planned to celebrate this historic feat. The edifice, which will cost more than $50,000 when finished, will be one of the showplaces of Greenville section. It is a gift from John Smith and his sister, Miss Margaret Smith of 94 Bentley Avenue. Ground was broken on Sunday, August the 12th. This is another photo of the cornerstone of being laid 2 weeks later. Shortly after the cornerstone laying, and after the church had been well into construction, 15 children received their first communion, 15 Negro children. They were believed to be the first colored first communion class in the county of Hudson. We have an accounting of who those 15 students were. They were William Best, Richard and Herbert Thompson, Thomas, Fred, and Francis Robinson, William Smith, Joseph, Alfred, and Dorothy Crawford, Edna and Marie Price, Eleanor and Marie Wilson, and Jacqueline Perkins. Many of these same 15 children had relatives who continued to be members of Christ the King well up as to recently, where the Perkins family still are parishioners at Christ the King. Now, Jersey City was not the only location upon which evangelization was taking place. There was also a concern for colored children in Bayonne who were seeking to make their sacraments. And so the Father Shavlin, along with the Knights of Columbus, used an area in one of the Knights of Columbus meeting centers to enthusiastically allow for the teaching of catechesis, along with the Mount Carmel Guild workers. Catholic colored children of Bayonne, after a month's survey among this race by Reverend Joseph A. Shavlin, pastor of the Church of Christ the King, will meet in the Knights of Columbus building at 4 p.m. afternoon for instruction in Christian doctrine. Father Shavlin was assisted by many workers, and the results were very encouraging. Throughout the early 1930s, well up until after Christ the King was built, the newspaper accountings of the activities of the parish were generous. There were multiple accounts of all of the activities that took place, from Sunday liturgies to the workings of the women from the St. Vincent de Paul Guild, numerous activities sponsored by the parishioners, and it seems as if they received as much press as they could. In August of 1931, there is a record in the lobby of the Sisters of the Trinitarian where they keep their diaries. And in the diary, this was an accounting that was mentioned. I received my first introduction of the colored of Jersey City in the guise of a class of about 40 children of all ages, from 3 woods upward, including even men and women. On this day, Dr. Lena Edwards was one of our colored physicians who was examining 50 children who would go to the St. Vincent de Paul camp for a week's vacation. 2 days later, in 2 bus loads, we took the children, and under the guidance of the Sisters of St. Dominic's, the children had a very enjoyable time and looked forward to the same treat for next year. The sisters would commute back and forth between Jersey City to Newark, because there had now begun a mission in Newark by the parish name of Our Lady Queen of Angels. It was a missionary cenacle, which would soon be also receiving letters of incorporation as a full-fledged parish. It is the sister church to Christ the King. Now, initially, there were only 2 nuns at the beginning of the work in 1930. And as time went on, there were 6 more. They often traveled back and forth late at night, visiting homes, assisting the poor, and directing the instruction of children and converts. Much of the success of the work in the apostolate to the Negro in Newark and in Jersey City was due to the tireless sacrifice made by these holy women of God. This is a slide of 4 of the sisters, and this was taken at Christ the King in 1931. It was Sister Benedict, Sister Francis Xavier, Sister John Anthony, and Sister Loretta Marie. October 5th of 1931, many of the women at Christ the King joined what was called the Confraternity of the Rosary, which we often refer to in short as Rosary. It's a spiritual society. And the confraternity and the consecration was done by a priest from Sacred Heart Church only a few blocks away. 125 members from Christ the King were inducted into the Rosarian Society that night at Christ the King by the blessings of Father Ripple, a Dominican priest. This is a letter from Father Shavlin, letting the Bishop Walsh know that the women of Christ the King were working toward their own spiritual upliftment with their practices in prayer, and initiated into the Rosarians by the Dominican order. He is also inviting the Bishop Shavlin to the upcoming dedication of the church, which is now completed. He states, "Today, the architect told me that the church will be ready for dedication on or after December the 20th. It has been a long wait for us. Before we would enjoy the honor and the happiness of sending you an invitation to our dedication, it has taken some time, but now it is drawing near and we are looking forward eagerly to this great day. Together with all of the parishioners of this humble little parish, I wish to thank you most heartily for your generosity and kindness, both to them and to me. I am, Right Reverend and dear Bishop, your humble servant, Joseph A. Shavlin." Now, this letter is dated November 13th, 1931. If you recall, the groundbreaking took place on August the 12th, and the cornerstone was laid on August the 28th. And so we are now a year later, the church is built, it is completely erected, and it is ready for service. The fact that it's going to have a dedication is monumental. Under canon law, a Catholic church cannot be dedicated unless it is financially free of any lien, any loan, or any mortgage. So for this church to have its inception in reference to its construction from the very beginning of August of 1930, and to be fully completed and ready to have a sanctification in 1931 was every bit miraculous. If we will recall that this is the beginning of the Great Depression. And so it's on the heels and the start of the Great Depression that these colored Catholics are migrants from the Great Depression of the South, not of much great means, most of them. And here they are with a church of their very own, the Church of Christ the King. This is a letter acknowledging that the bishop and his assistants would be attending the December 20th, 1931 dedication of the Church of Christ the King at 10:30 a.m. Shortly before the actual opening of the parish in reference to the church structure itself, Father Shavlin receives the remnants, the relics of two saints. The saints were Ugandan. They were two African martyrs. And these were the relics that were given to Father Shavlin as he began his mission and pastorship over the church for colored Catholics. June 3rd, 1931 is when this letter was sent to Father Shavlin along with the relics, because it is June 3rd that is the feast day of the martyrs of Uganda. C. Biden White, as you heard me mention earlier, was one of the first converts to the faith. He was also appointed as the aide to Father Shavlin, assisting with the evangelization and the mission to the colored Catholics. C. Biden Jones was also the historian of the church at that time. He kept accurate records, newspaper accountings, and even journals of what it was like to be amongst the first to build a church in Jersey City for themselves as colored Catholics. I spoke to you about these relics that Father Shavlin received, which is a tradition of the Catholic Church, that the relics of saints are often embedded within the altar. It is a reminder that we too are called to live a life of martyrdom and to live centered in Christ. These are some of the photos of the two Ugandan martyrs. They're not quite clear, but it gives you an idea. As the church was up and fledgling and going along, and from a small enclave of 12 to well into the numbers of 1,200 within a year plus of its origins, the Women of Christ the King were very much involved in a number of different missions. One of their locations for their house of spirituality was located at 85 Oak Street. We have parishioners who live at that very address to this day. And now, the day of dedication. This is the sketch that the architects drew up of what it would look like, the rendition of what Christ the King would look like once it was completed, the church for colored Catholics. On the day of dedication, the bishop, along with his whole entourage from the diocese, from the cathedral, come to Jersey City to not only bless and anoint the people, but to bless its sacred house of worship, as well as the community upon which it was centered. In his address to the colored Catholics and the Church of Christ the King, Bishop Walsh makes it known that he is building this house of worship not as a segregated place of worship, but as a place of safety and sanctuary so that the people would feel comfortable and not ostracized. But he makes it known throughout the diocese that Negro Catholics, Negroes as a whole, are welcomed in every single church within the Diocese of Newark. And if you will note to date on the newspaper, it's the day after the day of dedication. The dedication was Sunday, December 20th, 1931. If you will note, in 2 years, the community of Christ the King grew from a humble means of 20 members to 1,200 within a very short period of time. And on June 29th, it is announced that there would be the first sacrament at Christ the King Church of 223 colored Catholics. This is the day of dedication. These are the bishops, the priests, as they walk to celebrate the beginning days of Christ the King Church. The speaker at that gathering was a Father Lafarge, a Jesuit, who was well known for his work and involvement with the colored Catholics of that day. These are the numbers of people who gathered for the dedication of the church, well over 2,000, almost as many as were present for the groundbreaking and the cornerstone laying. This is Father Lafarge in the front with his arms raised up as he preaches to the community. Reverend John A. Lafarge, Jesuit, associate editor of the American magazine and an authority on Catholicism among the Negroes, who declared the colored people wish for nothing different than the rest of their fellow citizens. He spoke in an authority in administrative dealings with well over 12,000 Negro Catholics in the country. One of his great questions were, if 20 Catholics could grow to 12,000 in such a short period of time, what was happening with the rest of the church? This is the interior of Christ the King shortly after it was built, and those who are familiar with the pre-Vatican Catholic Church would notice right away that this would be a pre-Vatican interior because of the altar rails being in place and the altar still facing away from the congregation. Simultaneously, at the time that Christ the King was up and coming, there were colored Catholics gathering in New York just across the river for what was called the Federation of Colored Catholics. So the building of Christ the King, the formation of the people, did not happen in a vacuum. Simultaneously, other Catholic communities of lay folk were doing things that helped to engage them in the witness of their faith, as well as in the evangelization mission of the church. This is a newspaper accounting from June 30th of 1932. It talks about the number of Catholics that were confirmed that previous Sunday, particularly because it was the first colored Catholic class that were confirmed, 226 in number. Mind you, this is only 2 years, 2 short years after the formation of the church. And by September 27th of 1932, Leo J. Kane, who is the attorney who handled the deed and the property rights and everything for the formation of the parish, is now letting them know that all of the paperwork, all of the deeds have been filed and that the title is prepared and that they are about to transfer these papers back to the possession of those who will own them, the Church of Christ the King. Mr. Kane goes on to say, I beg to report that the title to the above property was today conveyed by the Lafayette Presbyterian Church to Walter L. Kane, who in turn conveyed such premises to the Roman Catholic Diocese of Newark. So this was the original paperwork where the purchase of the land was transferred from a Presbyterian church to a Catholic church for the benefit of a church that would be the home of Black Catholics in Jersey City. This is another photo of the 200 plus class of colored Catholics that were confirmed 2 years shy of the formation of the parish. And this is a still shot of the church in 1932. Can you imagine if we were able to evangelize and within 2 years have these degree and numbers of folk entering into the church? Now, this piece of artifact I found quite interesting. It is a notation in the Jersey Observer, which was a newspaper of the time, and it was November 10th, 1932. And it's talking about the Rosary Society of the Church of Christ the King, Jersey City, will go by bus tonight to the musical review and entertainment at the Church of St. Charles Borromeo, 141st Street, New York City. Monsignor O'Keefe, who has been in colored work for over 40 years, has sent a special invitation to the Church of Christ the King, and the Rosary Society has accepted the invitation of the Monsignor and will go in body. Now, the Church of St. Charles Borromeo is a Black Catholic parish in Harlem that I frequently attend Mass at to this day. I did not know about this history until reviewing the archives again, and I had to smile. For the last 3 summers, prior to COVID anyway, I have done the retreat, the spiritual day of reflection for the Rosarians at St. Charles of Borromeo in Harlem. This is yet another picture of first communicants from 1930s. One of the concerns of Christ the King Parish, initially and ongoing, and still to this day, is the mission of social justice. And so we see here a newspaper account that Negro jobless are receiving aid. Employment agency opened by the Church of Christ the King. And so the people of Christ the King, the parishioners of Christ the King, did not just become complacent once they had built their church as a place of safe haven for themselves. They were out in the trenches, so to speak, in the street, helping those who needed help. because it is, again, remember, the Great Depression. One of the missions that the people, particularly the women of Christ the King, would gather shoes and give shoes to those who were shoeless. Now, for us in the 2020 year and in the 21st century, many of us have so many shoes, we don't know what to do with most of them. But that was not the case, particularly during those times. And people often had one pair of shoes that were often well worn with a piece of cardboard in the sole. And so the women of Christ the King and their families made it their business to supply people with shoes as well as to help them with employment. This is a photo of the New York Amsterdam in 1932. And it's showing the picture of two prelates sitting at a celebration. The celebration that they're sitting at is a celebration of the dedication in New Orleans to the University of Xavier University, which I have some affiliation with. I thought it quite interesting, the time sequence of seeing Christ the King Church formed during a time when the Federation of Colored Catholics from around the nation are gathering, and as well when the University of Louisiana of Xavier University is itself being commissioned and blessed for its new upcoming building. This is the gathering. This is the building of the university that has just been built particularly by St. Catherine Drexel, who was an heiress of the Drexel fortune. She became a nun. She took all of her money and she endowed it for the education of Native children and recently freed children of African enslaved peoples. Xavier University is the only historical Black college university that is both a historical HBCU and Catholic. This is the building in 1932. October 29th in 1932, this is the building that was being consecrated at the same time shortly after Christ the King had come in of its own. I have a particular affinity for this particular building because this is where I did my studies when I did my studies there at Xavier. Now, you heard me mention that Christ the King was formed because the people of Christ the King wanted to have a safe haven, to be able to feel safe. This letter is an excerpt from a letter that was written by a parishioner who was a parishioner at St. Patrick's in Jersey City, only a few blocks away from Christ the King. St. Patrick's was a mostly Irish community for its parish. And 3 years or so after Christ the King has been formed, the nuns are living at 484 Bramhall Avenue, about 2 or 3 doors away from St. Patrick's Church and its rectory. And the nuns, being who they are in service and mission to their parishioners, often have many of the colored Catholics there for dinner, for catechism class, and to work and to study. The parishioner from St. Patrick's was not very happy about this. The letter says, 485 Bramhall Avenue, Jersey City, August 19th, 1933. To the Right Reverend Bishop Walsh, my dear father, 4 of your missionary sisters have rented a house at 484 Bramhall Avenue. They work with the colored people. The neighbors are very much depressed. It will bring colored people on the block and the property will be very much depreciated. Their house is on the block with St. Patrick's Church, 2 doors from the rectory. Father Kelly, our pastor, has worked to keep the colored people away from this neighborhood. I know if he was home, he would intercede for us. There are other nice houses where they could locate in the district of the colored people. The people in this neighborhood own their homes and are very proud of them. Naturally, we are all upset, hoping you will give this your attention. I am respectfully yours, Miss Jessie L. Thompson. So this is the climate upon which Christ the King was not only functioning in, it was the climate of what led the parishioners such as Mary Ward and her sister parishioners, to ask the bishop in the first place for a parish that they could call their own. And so now we're at December 14th of 1933. And this is a letter from Father Shovlin. Father Shovlin writes a letter to my dear Father Glover, who was then one of the vicars, and he is referencing the residence that he is now living at 54 Union Street, which is his residence and the rectory for Christ the King, as you will note above on the letterhead, 52 Union Street. And he's basically telling the Reverend of the vicar of the Archdiocese that he is moving to another location, one, because he doesn't have any heat where he lives, and the new residence would also as well be cheaper, and at the most, it would be on the same street, Ocean Avenue, not very far from the church. So we move from the 1930s into 1940s, and we see that we have a bustling and flourishing parish. This is 1946, and it's the parish basketball team, which has received the Department of Sportsmanship trophy. These are a number of the parishioners, as well as the Parks Department for the city of Jersey City. 1959 is a photo of a communion breakfast of the Rosary Society. The Rosary Society is one of the main spiritual ministries that was functioning within the capacity of the parish. To my far right, I guess how you see it on the screen, you see Mrs. Watkins. Mrs. Watkins was one of the leaders for Girl Scouts. She was my Girl Scout leader when I was a very young girl, and her dedication to the young ladies of the parish then and now, because Miss Watkins is still alive, she's into her 90th plus years, was that she taught us to be able to believe not only in God, but in ourselves and in the capacity to be good leaders, both civic and within the church. Next to Miss Watkins is Sister Angelique. This right here is one of our faithful mothers of the church, Mrs. Drusilla Pittman. Mrs. Pittman was a phenomenal lay minister. She was steadfast, she had holy boldness, and a courage to stand her ground. It is out of her relationship with the parish that we have come to be able to say we have come this far by faith. This again is an inner picture of the sanctuary during the 1950s prior to Vatican II, and after as well from the time that the parish was formed. Now, Christ the King was not only good for evangelizing and getting people in the community to join the church. There was a woman by the name of Jeanette Jackson, who I showed in the photo of the first converts. 18 months after Jeanette was baptized, she went on to evangelize 300 plus people to the witness of the Catholic faith. When we look into the sacramental records of the baptismal records of Christ the King, you see Jeanette Jackson's name straight through. Within 18 months, 300 people. In all of my years of doing catechesis, I may have brought maybe 125 to the baptismal font, and that's over many, many years. Within 18 months, she had 300. Along with lay leadership, we were blessed to know that from our humble beginnings, we had 3 men of African American ancestry who went on to the priesthood. This is one of our very own Father Benedict Taylor, who was a Franciscan. And this is Monsignor Riley. This is a picture that would have taken place, if I'm not mistaken, in the late 1950s, maybe early 1960s. I don't have the exact date. But if you heard me mention earlier, Dr. Lena Edwards, whose daughter was the first one baptized and her husband was also an adult convert, Dr. Lena Edwards, her own very own son, was ordained as a priest, and he only passed away a few years ago. This is another picture of Miss Pittman, who was one of our lay leaders of the church. This is a record of 1967 from a communion breakfast. And we see the names of the women who were staunch, devout Catholics and as well civic leaders in the community. Mrs. Lillian Walker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hauser, Miss Rosalie Daniels, and along with them is Monsignor E. Riley. If you remember that I referenced that one of our parishioners, who we refer to as the mother of our church, is celebrating her 100th birthday next week, it is our very own Mrs. Rosalie Daniels. This here is a photo from 1969 of the Girl Scouts of Christ the King on a journey to this nation's capital. And they were met by Cornelius Gallagher, who was the congressman of that time. Many of these women in this picture, or the young ladies in this picture, many of them are still current parishioners and lay ministers within the parish. And here we are, Christ the King, 90 years later and still going strong. When many churches and parishes have been forced to close, the stone which the builder rejected has become the cornerstone. That is a well-known scripture for many of us, and we take pride in it at Christ the King, knowing that we were formed out of the sin of racism through no fault of our own, and yet we still stand full of faith, full of hope, full of love, welcoming to whoever wants to come and have a seat at the table. We have celebrated our 50th anniversary in 1980. This is the inward sight of Christ the King after Vatican II had come and the church turned the altars around to face the congregation. This would be the Mass during the 50th anniversary, which was celebrated in 1980. And if you will take note that in Christ the King, our resurrected crucifix is in the representation of a Christ that is of African Asiatic ancestry. He is a risen Christ, and he is adorned on our altar in ebony wood. One of the reasons that Christ the King for many years has been self-sustaining is because of the generosity of many of its benefactors and its parishioners, self-sustaining. And for many of those years, one of our great loves of Christ the King and one of our benefactors was the late Mrs. Dorothy Hammond Miller. And this is Mrs. Hammond Miller, Dorothy right here. We affectionately called her Dottie. And this is our 75th celebration, still going strong, all because of faith. And our 80th, and we said then, and still we rise. We not only had clergy that were ordained into the priesthood, we were also blessed to have 3 African-American permanent members of the diaconate. Deacon Keith, who recently passed away 2 years ago, Deacon Keith McKnight, and in the rear, the senior deacon, Deacon Leon Johnson, who passed away several years ago. Both of them were foundational in helping us to remember who we were and whose we were, not only as a Catholic people, but as a Black Catholic people. And the loves of my life at Christ the King are my children and my youth ministry. They are the lifeblood of our parish today. This is a photo of parts of our youth ministry, choir and liturgical team and liturgical dancers practicing for Sunday liturgy, along with their director of music, Mr. Greg Servants. Yet again, another photo. And if you will note in the far left hand, there is a statue replica of St. Martin de Porres, a well-known saint of African and European and Native relationship. He is the saint most looked to for social justice, St. Martin de Porres. And this is during one of our Feast of Christ the King, when we're having jubilant praise and worship. Nothing like giving God the glory. And this is Christ the King today, still standing 90 years long, with hopes of lasting another 90 years into the kingdom. The Church of Christ the King.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, with Valerie. We're pretty much running up against the standard time for these programs. So even though there's probably a dozen different directions I'd like to take a conversation with you, we will certainly continue the conversations that we've had. I've learned a lot from you as we prepare for this program, and I look forward to future programs. But for today, I just want to really especially note the use of archival materials to tell the story. As a special collections and archives librarian, it is always gratifying to see historic records put to such good use so effectively. And yeah, I just really want to thank you again for agreeing to do this program. Congratulate you and the parish on 90 years, and hopes for many, many years to come. So
Thank you. Thank you for having me.